The Invisible Assistant, an Eli Marks short mystery. Written by John Gaspard. Read by Jim Cunningham. Now for my next effect, I'm going to need another volunteer. I timed this statement to land just as the applause from the last trick was starting to wane. I had completed a well-received, ambitious card routine with the blonde volunteer to my left. What was her name again? Jane? Joan? And now I needed another willing soul to join the two of us on stage. Just to ensure that I haven't prearranged any of this, let's make the selection of the next volunteer more, random, I said casually, as if I didn't say that same phrase in the exact same way in every show. We'll let chance decide who will join the two of us here on stage, I continued, neatly sidestepping the need to remember the blonde's name. I'm going to toss this into the crowd, I said, picking up the bowling ball that I had made magically appear earlier in the act. And whoever catches it... Laughter drowned out the rest of the sentence, as it always did, which was convenient because I didn't actually have an ending for the sentence. I dropped the heavy ball to the stage and reached into my bag, pulling out a bright orange Nerf ball. After the unfortunate incident that happened at the last show, let's try this instead. Heads up! I tossed the Nerf ball into the center of the crowd, and a hand shot up and grabbed it in midair. Terrific, I said, squinting, trying to see past the bright stage lights, which were positioned low and directly in my eyes. That was often the case when doing a corporate show in a low-ceilinged hotel ballroom. Now, you toss it somewhere else in the room. The ball sailed through the room again and was snatched out of the air by another hand. Great. Now to really make it random, why don't you toss it one more time? The ball sailed across the room, flying over all the folks finishing their identical chicken lunches, and headed straight toward a couple who had taken a standing room-only spot on the far wall. Fortunately, the man had great timing, reaching out and snatching the ball out of the air before it could hit the woman in the face. With the stage lights in my eyes, this was all a squinty tableau, but I sensed that the man wasn't enthusiastic about being the final catcher in this selection process. Coaxing would be required. "Impressive catch, sir," I said, stepping to the edge of the stage. "Come on up and give us a hand, will you?" My Uncle Harry had taught me that particular phrasing, which was designed to get the audience to applaud without realizing that they were being asked to do so. They responded on cue, and the man who had caught the last toss of the Nerf ball began to move hesitantly toward the front of the room. In my new position at the lip of the stage, I was finally able to get a look at him as well as the woman he was standing with, although it took me a moment longer than it should have to recognize her. It was my ex-wife, and the guy with the great timing, who was trudging slowly toward the stage, was her relatively new husband. "And what is your name?" I asked as he stepped onto the stage. He glared at me because he knew damn well I knew his name, but this was a show after all, and I had to keep things moving. "Fred," he growled. "Fred," I repeated, with more pep than was really required. I traditionally always referred to him by his full name and title, Homicide Detective Fred Hutton, but I'd have to set that annoying habit aside for the time being. "Fred, please step to my right, and Joan," I turned to the blonde. "Melissa," she corrected. "Melissa, of course, if you'd stand here on my left." I had done this routine maybe 1,000 times, but the sudden surprise addition of my ex-wife's husband on stage, not to mention my ex-wife in the audience, had scrambled the routine in my head. "I don't know if you folks can feel it out there, but there's a real chemistry between these two volunteers," I lied. In reality, there could not have been less chemistry on stage, as witnessed by the two stiffs flanking me. I soldiered on. To demonstrate the connection, I propose we perform a short experiment using some playing cards and these two powerfully attractive personalities. The flat response this elicited from both volunteers actually produced a collective chuckle from the crowd. With that, I launched into my cards across routine, counting 3 cards into Melissa's outstretched hand, and then 7 cards into the hand that homicide detective Fred Hutton had reluctantly put forward. I caught his eye as I finished counting the 7th card, and the icy stare he gave me told me exactly how much he was enjoying his time on stage. To recap, I continued, doing my best to remember where I was in the routine and where I needed to go, I placed 3 cards in Melissa's hands and 7 cards in Fred's hands. I nearly used his full name and title, but caught myself at the last second. Now, with the help of my invisible assistant, we will demonstrate the powerful attraction between these 2 happy volunteers. This produced another ripple of laughter from the crowd. I plowed forward using homicide detective Fred Hutton's stone face to great comic effect as I completed each phase of the trick, calling on the help of the invisible assistant at each key point. First, when he counted the cards, homicide detective Fred Hutton found that he had 8 cards. He counted again and found that he now held 9 cards. At the same time, the blonde stack of cards diminished from 3 to 2 and then to 1. The routine came to an end with all 10 cards in Fred's hand and only 1 card in the blonde's. That card, of course, was her selected and signed card from the earlier ambitious card routine. The audience gave the performance a better response than it really deserved, and for a brief moment, I considered ending the show right there. But I could hear my Uncle Harry's voice in the back of my head admonishing me for considering ending the act with volunteers still on stage. "The final applause should be for you and you alone," he would have said. "No magician worth his salt wants to share a standing ovation with a volunteer." Although such an ovation seemed unlikely, I ushered the 2 volunteers off the stage, persuading the audience to give them another well-deserved round of applause. I then moved right into the classic magical snowstorm effect, which I, and virtually every other magician in the world, used as my finale when a big finish was required. I triggered my iPod with the remote switch in my pocket, and suddenly the room was filled with Nat King Cole singing "Walking in a Winter Wonderland" as a snowstorm appeared in my hands and blew out onto the first 3 rows. This brought the show to a quasi-rousing close and littered the stage with small bits of white paper, which I'm sure was always a delight for the hotel cleaning staff. The corporate meeting planner met me as I came off stage with a big grin and a check that, sadly, wasn't nearly as large as her smile. All in all, a profitable, if slightly bumpy, corporate show. "Imagine my surprise when I saw you 2 in the audience," I said. "Imagine my surprise when you called Fred on stage," replied my ex-wife. Homicide detective Fred Hutton declined to contribute to our conversation, instead choosing to stare at a point somewhere in a far corner of the hotel restaurant. His wife, Deirdre, was taking more delight in his impromptu performance than I might have expected. When we were married, she kept a cool demeanor at nearly all times and rarely took delight in anything, especially me. We were considered to be, as many people later confessed, an odd match. "That was a nice routine," she continued, with the cards moving between the people and the invisible assistant. "Thanks. That's Cards Across, a classic. Next time you're in Vegas, check out Mac King's version. It's sublime." The waitress took that moment to appear with the coffee I had ordered. I stirred in some cream and took a long sip. "Had I known you 2 wanted to see the show, I would have reserved you some actual seats. It was something of a spur-of-the-moment decision to come see you." This produced a barely audible grunt from homicide detective Fred Hutton. "So it wasn't a mutual decision?" I suggested. "Maybe not, but here we are," Deirdre said, leaning forward, clearly finished with the chit-chat portion of the meeting. "I want to get your take on something, a case we're working on." While we were married, Deirdre had risen steadily through the district attorney's office and was now well ensconced and well respected as an assistant DA. Her close working relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department's Homicide Division had produced several stunning murder convictions and 1 divorce. This last occurrence was due primarily to her too close working relationship with homicide detective Fred Hutton, although I'm sure that somewhere, somehow, she blamed me. "You've read about the Josiah Manning murder-suicide?" she asked. I nodded and took another sip of coffee. "I heard about it in passing," I said, "but I don't know any of the details." "But you know who Josiah Manning was?" I shrugged. "He was a big anti-death penalty, anti-suicide guy, right?" "The biggest." "And he killed someone in the opposition?" "Not just someone. He basically killed the opposition. Harley Keller, the leader of what people have come to call the pro-death movement." "Because he believed in suicide?" "More than believed. Harley Keller was a true zealot. He was the suicide poster child." "They have that? Weird." Although my alleged quip drew only a scowl from Deirdre, I thought I detected the faintest hint of a smile on homicide detective Fred Hutton's lips. Then it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "So let me get this straight. The anti-suicide guy who believed fervently in the sanctity of life murdered the pro-suicide guy, then to top it all off, he killed himself?" "That's what the police believe," Deirdre said, throwing a sidelong glance at her husband. He did not return it. "Well, get Alanis Morissette on the line, because that's pretty ironic." Deirdre sighed. "Eli, do you have any cultural references that are less than 20 years old?" I was tempted to dazzle her with a Nipsey Russell-style poem on the topic, but thought better of it. "So your opinion differs from that of the homicide department?" "On several key points, yes," she said, as she began to dig through her purse. "Which is why I wanted to talk to you. Why I wanted both of us to talk to you," she added. "On occasion, you've offered a unique perspective that I think could be useful in this instance. I believe the phrase you used when we were married was, 'You have a bizarre way of looking at things.'" "Yes," she said, leaving it at that. She pulled an iPad from the depths of her purse. "I want you to look at this." She opened the cover, clicking and swiping until she found what she was looking for. "This is about 4 years old, and it is just one of many, many similar videos." She hit a play button and handed me the iPad. I tilted it so that homicide detective Fred Hutton could see as well, but he waved me away. "I've seen it," he said, crossing his arms and slouching back into his chair, setting his gaze once again on an invisible point across the room. The sound of an argument pulled my attention back to the iPad. Actually, it wasn't technically an argument, as only one person was talking, or more accurately, shouting. "That's Harley Keller," Deirdre pointed out as I looked at the man on the screen. He was gaunt and pale, a crew cut consisting of wisps of white hair covering his large, bony head. His eyes, which burned at someone off camera, were sharp, steely blue. He was shouting, ranting, really, so vehemently that small specks of white spittle were visible around his lips and on his chin. The video cut at that point to another man, who listened intently to the bile being thrown at him. Like Harley, he appeared to be in his early 60s, but there was a calmness and a warmth to him that made him seem younger. "Josiah Manning?" I suggested, beating Deirdre to the punch. She nodded, and I turned back to the screen. The show they were appearing on wasn't the Charlie Rose show, but they certainly could have been sued by Charlie's people. They had blatantly lifted the program's distinctive look right down to the same round oak table and deep dark backdrop. "Death is a basic human right," Harley was shouting. "A person has a right to their death just as they have a right to their life. If I wish to end my life, that is my personal decision, and you and the public and the state have no right to stand in the way of my decision." He stared daggers at Josiah, seeming to dare him to speak. Josiah returned the stare, but his was warm and without judgment. "Don't you want to answer that?" Harley snapped. "Gladly," Josiah said softly. "It's just that since you've interrupted me at every opportunity this evening, I just wanted to make sure that I, in turn, was not about to inadvertently interrupt you." Harley sat back and spread his hands open before him, giving the floor to Josiah. "Well, I certainly respect your opinion," he said quietly. "I cannot endorse it nor justify it. Life, in all of its forms, is sacred. It was given to us, and it's not ours to take away, whether via a lethal injection in a prison or an exhaust hose in a garage." "So you insist," Harley said, cutting him off, "that you have a right to keep me alive, and I don't have a right to choose the time of my death. Is that what you're saying? But that is complete and utter—" Some network censor somewhere had pulled the sound down for the next few profanity-laden seconds of his rant, so Deirdre took that opportunity to take the iPad back and hit the pause button. "Wow," I said. "After seeing that, if you told me one of those guys killed the other guy and then himself, I would have sworn it was Harley Keller who pulled that trigger twice, not Josiah Manning." "My point exactly," Deirdre said, as she slipped the tablet back into the dark recesses of her purse. "I'm just having a bit of trouble getting the homicide department to see things my way." "It's cut and dried," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton grumbled, "and that's the truth." "The truth is rarely cut and never dried," I misquoted, not at all sure what that was supposed to mean. "So what does Homicide think happened?" "Harley Keller invited Josiah Manning to his home," he began. "His home?" "Harley Keller lived in a townhouse on Cedar Lake," Deirdre explained. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton gave her a long look and then continued. "Harley Keller invited Josiah Manning to his home," he repeated slowly. "At some point, the two must have gone upstairs to Mr. Keller's office on the second floor. While in that office, Josiah Manning shot Harley Keller point blank in the chest." "Yikes," I said involuntarily. "He died almost immediately," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton continued, ignoring my short outburst. "Josiah Manning then went downstairs, sat down in a chair in the living room, put the gun in his mouth, and pulled the trigger." "Where did you find the gun?" "On the floor next to the chair." "Powder burns?" "Residue was found on the fingers of Josiah Manning's right hand." "How about Harley Keller?" "His hands were clean." I sat back and considered what I had heard. I took a sip of my coffee, which had already turned cold. Maybe someone else shot them both and then left? Homicide Detective Fred Hutton shook his head. "Place was locked up tight. Both front and rear entrances were secured with heavy chain locks. All windows locked from the inside. Responding officers had to break down the front door after neighbors reported gunshots." "Suicide note?" He shook his head. I took another sip of coffee and then turned to Deirdre. "And you think it happened some other way?" "Yes," she said. "What's odd about this," I said, as a new thought began to dawn on me, "is that in reality, there were 3 deaths that night." This produced curious looks from both of them. "How do you figure?" Deirdre asked. I counted them out on my fingers for emphasis. "Harley Keller and Josiah Manning both died," I said, "but so too did Josiah Manning's reputation. I mean, the method of his death will now always overshadow his life's work. The anti-suicide guy will now always be known as the guy who killed himself, and Harley Keller certainly had the motive to put that reputation to rest." I finished the rest of my coffee. "Can we go look at the crime scene?" I said as I stood up. Deirdre was already on her feet. "I thought you'd never ask." You know how sometimes you can tell when a couple is arguing even when you can't hear them? I mean, just by their body language? That was the sense I got as I followed the happy couple across town to the Cedar Lake neighborhood. From my vantage point in the front seat of my car, I could see them talking in the front seat of theirs, and from where I sat, it did not look like a happy conversation. For some odd reason, that made me sad, because I figured If she had to leave me, the very least she could do would try to be happy with the guy she left me for. I mean, otherwise, what was the point? In fact, on the few occasions I had witnessed these arguments, I had to restrain myself from saying something along the lines of, "Geez, you left me so you could argue with him? You could have skipped the divorce and continued arguing with me." But I wisely never said that, at least not so far. Harley Keller lived, or had lived, on Cedar Lake, the most mysterious of the Minneapolis chain of lakes, primarily because it was impossible to drive around it. You could drive past it, but not around it. His townhouse, like all the others connected to it, looked relatively new and completely identical. A different, brightly colored windsock hung in front of each entryway, probably in a failed attempt to aid in the identification process. Deirdre and Homicide Detective Fred Hutton were already unlocking the front door when I caught up to them. "No crime scene tape?" I observed. "It's no longer a crime scene," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton grunted as he pushed the door open. I was surprised to be greeted by the sound of a yipping dog. "Hey, there's a dog," I said, clearly stating the obvious. "That's weird. Why is there a dog?" "There are a variety of pets still in residence," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton stated flatly. I looked at Deirdre for a more complete explanation. "Harley Keller had a dog, 3 cats, a bird, and an aquarium. We were going to turn them all over to animal control, but the next of kin requested against that," she said. She gestured toward the identical doorway to our right. "The lady next door stops in several times a day to take care of them. His next of kin are coming to town at the end of the week to handle the estate." "That's quite a menagerie," I said, "especially for a pro-death kind of guy like Harley Keller." "Yes, it is," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton said with what sounded like a sigh. This was followed immediately by something that sounded like a sneeze, and then another, and another. "Fred's allergic to cats and dogs," Deirdre said by way of explanation. At that moment, a small mutt of a dog came racing toward us, yelping happily. Because Homicide Detective Fred Hutton was the only one of us allergic to animals, the dog naturally went right for him. He dropped a slimy, spit-covered rubber ball at the detective's feet. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton gave the ball a disgruntled kick as he pulled out a handkerchief to catch his next sneeze. The handkerchief arrived a millisecond too late. As the dog chased after the errant ball, a large tabby cat arrived and began to wend its way around Homicide Detective Fred Hutton's ankles. The cat was soon joined by another cat, this one small and black. Then the dog returned with the ball, and the next phase of sneezing began. "Can we proceed?" Homicide Detective Fred Hutton pleaded between sneezes. "By all means," I agreed. "Give me the nickel tour." "Sure. The dog is named Gypsy, and the cats are Jinx, Penny, and—" Deirdre was cut off before she could complete her list. "He means a tour of the crime scene," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton barked. "Oh," she said, acting innocent. "I thought it wasn't a crime scene anymore." I put a hand up to stop them. "The way you two are behaving, it feels like it could easily become a crime scene again at any moment. Could we just stick to the facts of the case?" While her husband blew his nose, Deirdre pointed out the chair where Josiah Manning had allegedly shot himself. It was an oversized recliner, upholstered in a light blue plush fabric. A large bloodstain covered the chair's headrest. On a hunch, I tugged on each armrest. They opened, revealing a storage chamber within each arm. Both chambers were not only empty, but spotless. Deirdre pointed out the place on the floor where he had dropped the gun. I gestured toward the chair, and she nodded her permission. I slowly sat in the recliner, taking care not to lean back on the headrest. The blood had long since dried, but human nature dictated that I keep my distance, and so I did. I mimed the motions of putting a gun in my mouth and pulling the trigger. My arm dropped to the side. I looked down to see if my imaginary gun had landed in the spot Deirdre had indicated. To my mind's eye, it was a direct hit. She then headed toward the stairway. I followed, and once he was able to disentangle himself from his animal friends, Homicide Detective Fred Hutton trailed behind us. We passed an impressively huge fish tank built into one wall. The fish swam aimlessly back and forth, looking exotic and colorful. I glanced at the tank and then back to the sniffling mess behind me. "You allergic to fish, too?" I asked, trying to hide how much I was enjoying the question. "With my luck, yes," he said as another sneeze arrived. We followed Deirdre up the stairs, with both cats doing their best to get under Homicide Detective Fred Hutton's feet as he blearily navigated the stairs. Harley Keller's office was a large room at the top of the staircase. A computer sat atop an IKEA-style desk with matching bookcases lining one wall. Photos of Harley with notables lined the other wall. The rest of the room consisted of a series of cat beds, a dog bed, and various carpeted structures designed to provide an indoor cat with the climbing experience they were being denied by being forced to live inside. To prove that thesis, a cat I hadn't yet seen was resting atop the highest structure in the room. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton stood in the doorway and sneezed. As if responding to this call, Gypsy had returned and dropped the spit-covered ball at the detective's feet. Once he realized that the human had no desire to play with him, the dog sniffed at the ball and then marched over to his rag-filled dog bed, circling the bed 3 times before finally settling in. I looked down at a large dark brown blood stain in the center of the room, which had soaked into the cream-colored plush carpeting. "Based on the position of the body and the blood splatter, it appears that Harley was shot right here," Deirdre said, pointing to where the body had fallen. "So," I said, trying to work out the chronology, "Harley and Josiah came up here. Josiah shoots Harley in the chest. He falls there," I said, indicating the blood stain. "Josiah then marches downstairs and shoots himself in the head." "That's the police version, yes," she said. I stooped down. From where I was standing, I could see down the stairs into the living room. However, the recliner where Josiah had shot himself was not in view. I turned to Deirdre. "And what's your theory? That Harley shot Josiah and then shot himself? That makes more sense to me." "Even though the facts clearly do not support that supposition?" Homicide Detective Fred Hutton's voice was a little ragged from the sneezing, but his attitude came through loud and clear. "I think if you insist on looking at only some of the facts, you can easily reach the wrong conclusion." I recognized Deirdre's tone, and my stomach tightened in what could only be called a Pavlovian response. I crossed the room and sat at the desk, trying to gather my thoughts while the happy couple continued to squabble. I did my best to block out their bickering while I sorted through the elements of the puzzle. I knew from past experience that if Deirdre was insisting about a point this vehemently, there was likely something behind it, and it was worth pursuing. She was adamant that something wasn't quite right in what we were seeing. She didn't believe that Josiah shot Harley and then himself. And given what little I knew about the two men, I was inclined to agree. However, if Harley merely wanted Josiah dead, he could have just shot him, and then, if he was so inclined, he could have shot himself. But instead, he felt the need to kill Josiah's reputation as well. But how? I thought about all the methods I knew to get an object from one side of the stage to the other, all the ways I had learned to take something off a person without them knowing it, and the more useful art of putting something on them without tipping them off. I thought about mirrors and stooges and dual realities and other forms of misdirection. I thought about my act from that afternoon. And then a glimmer of an idea began to take hold in the back of my head, but it was having trouble making itself heard above the din in the room. "Could you two please knock it off?" I finally said, saying it much louder than I had intended. My volume and tone produced the desired effect, and they both stopped in mid-argument. I can't hear myself think, I added, at a much lower level. I got up and saw they were each looking at me like contrite children. I moved to the center of the room. So, this is where Harley was standing when he was shot. Deirdre nodded, double-checked it with Homicide Detective Fred Hutton, and then nodded again. Is it possible that someone could use a handgun like the one used in this case and shoot themselves in the chest? I mean, hold their arm out, point the gun at their own chest, and shoot themselves? I demonstrated what I meant, stretching out my arm and turning my hand back toward my chest. Deirdre started to answer, but Homicide Detective Fred Hutton beat her to it. Yes, but a bullet to the heart would produce nearly instant death, he said. There would be no time to get the gun downstairs, not to mention the powder burns on the hand, he added. Deirdre held up a hand for him to stop talking. He didn't look like he wanted to, but a sudden sneeze shifted his attention away from me and back to his handkerchief. Deirdre jumped on this pause. What are you thinking? She said, stepping toward me. What if it happened this way? I began, heading toward the door. Oh, do either of you have a gun? I mean an unloaded gun, about the same size that was used here? Still unable to speak, Homicide Detective Fred Hutton shook his head and then registered a look of surprise as Deirdre began to dig through her purse. A moment later, she produced a small handgun. I checked it out of the armory this morning, she said by way of explanation, in case we needed to reenact anything. Don't worry, it's not loaded. Great, I said, taking the gun from her, surprised at its heft. It was a little heavy, but not too heavy for what I had in mind. Also, do you have any gloves, like the ones you use when sifting through evidence? Deirdre nodded at Homicide Detective Fred Hutton, who glared back at her. There was a short, tense standoff, and then he acquiesced. He put his handkerchief in one pocket and then pulled a pair of thin latex gloves out of the other. He handed them to me, and I pulled one onto my right hand as I sprinted out of the room and down the stairs. I ducked into the kitchen for a moment, and the couple had made it to the base of the stairs by the time I returned. Okay, I said, beginning my impromptu presentation. Let's try this scenario on for size. I'm Harley Keller, and I have just invited Josiah Manning over to my townhouse. I'm not entirely sure how I got him here, maybe something about burying the hatchet. But anyway, I invite him, and he comes over. I walked to the front door and mimed each action as I narrated. Josiah comes in the front door. I welcome him and lock the door behind him and chain the door. Then, with his back to me, I knock him out with the butt of the gun. I went through these actions, pretending to strike and then lower an unconscious body into the recliner. Now, this puts a pretty big wound on the back of Josiah's head, but that will be obliterated when I put the gun in his mouth, wrap his fingers around the trigger, and then pull it. Blam! My impression of the sound of the gun was loud enough to make Deirdre jump. I patted her on the shoulder as I headed back to the stairs. Sorry about that, I said. Anyway, now, Josiah is dead, and he's got powder marks on his right hand. The first half of my plan is completed. Now for phase 2. I took the stairs 2 at a time and then had to wait while Deirdre and Homicide Detective Fred Hutton trudged back up the stairs. Once again, the cats did their best to trip him up. I waited patiently for them to arrive, and then waited a few more seconds for another quick round of sneezing. Okay, so now it's Harley's turn, I said, stretching my right arm as far in front of me as I could and pointing the gun back toward my chest. I shoot myself point blank in the heart, drop the gun, and die a few seconds later. I looked up and smiled at the couple in the doorway. Just that simple, I added. Deirdre squinted at me, and Homicide Detective Fred Hutton shook his head. Now, I continued, you're probably wondering how Harley got the gun from the floor next to him, down the stairs, and next to Josiah's body. Yes, we are, Deirdre said, sounding annoyed. That's the whole point. Well, I think he did it the same way I got the cards from Joan's hands to his hands during my act today, I said, gesturing toward Homicide Detective Fred Hutton. Melissa, he said, and then blew his nose. What? The volunteer's name was Melissa. Whatever. So, Deirdre said, clearly frustrated, how did you get the cards from her hands to his hands? I smiled. With an invisible assistant, I said. Before she could pursue this further, I checked that I was standing in the right spot and pointed the gun at my chest. Blam! I shouted, again making her jump. I clutched my chest with one hand while dropping the gun to the floor with the other, and then I prayed. A moment later, my prayers were rewarded as we heard the patter of paws on carpet. We turned to see that Gypsy had jumped out of his dog bed and was scampering across the room. He happily picked up the gun between his teeth. It was a mouthful, but he was able to grasp it tightly, and then he trotted out of the room and down the stairs. We followed, heading halfway down the stairs, just in time to see him drop the gun right next to the recliner. He started back toward us, forcing me to run back up the stairs to Harley's office. A dog that smart? You could teach him that trick in just a few days, I said over my shoulder. Well, that covers the gun, Homicide Detective Fred Hutton said between sneezes. But what about the powder burns? I returned to my position in the center of the office and peeled off the glove. In the few seconds I have left after shooting myself, I explained, I peel off the glove and drop it to the floor. I did just that. But we would have found it by the body, Homicide Detective Fred Hutton began, but he was interrupted by Gypsy, who ran back into the room and up to the glove. He sniffed it for a brief second, then picked it up and carried it back to his dog bed, where he began to chew on it happily. In just a few seconds, it was virtually shredded. I ducked into the kitchen and put a dog treat in that glove, I said. But I suspect that Harley probably used a linen glove and soaked it in chicken or beef broth the day before. I think a thorough examination of Gypsy's bed might even produce a few remaining tatters of that glove, which would undoubtedly have powder burns on it. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton made a move toward the bed and the glove Gypsy was currently enjoying, but the dog growled and bared his teeth. The detective wisely stepped back from the dog bed. "We'll look into that," he said dryly. "What I'm really hoping, Detective, is that you can find it in your heart not to arrest that dog as an accessory to murder." This produced a smile and a chuckle, but not from Homicide Detective Fred Hutton. He turned and spoke sharply to Deirdre. "That's not funny." "Oh, I don't know," she said. "It's a little funny. You just have no sense of humor." This remark triggered a new phase of their ongoing argument. I listened for a few painful seconds and then held up my hands in protest. "Here's the thing," I said as I backed toward the door. "I'm happy to help you out from time to time, but if it means having to endure an episode of the Bickersons every time I see you two, count me out." Deirdre gave me a puzzled look. In case you're keeping track, that reference is probably well over 60 years old. This did little to abate her confusion. "Thanks again, Gypsy, for being the best invisible assistant I've ever seen," I continued, tossing the remaining dog treat across the room. The little dog jumped up and caught it in the air. As I headed down the stairs, I could hear the crunching of that dog treat, followed by the sound of an argument beginning anew. This was cut short by another flurry of sneezing, which was the last sound I heard before I shut the door behind me. This has been The Invisible Assistant by John Gaspard, read by Jim Cunningham, produced and engineered by Albert's Bridge Books at Grass Lake Studios. All rights reserved. Albert's Bridge Books presents The Last Customer, an Eli Marks short mystery, written by John Gaspard, read by Jim Cunningham. I thought he was going to be my last customer, which was a bit ironic because after a long day in the shop, he was also my first customer. Such is the sad life of a brick-and-mortar magic shop in this day of online browsing and shopping. At the moment, though, I was in a bit of a fog trying to decide if the customer's shaggy hair would best be described as dishwater blonde or sandy brown. In the midst of what I'm guessing you would call a transaction, the bell over the shop's entrance tinkled. The last customer and I looked at the door as it swung open, and for a moment I thought it might have just been the wind, as no one was immediately visible in the doorway. Then I glanced down and saw a kid. He might have been 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. I really have no concept of the standard height-to-age ratio with kids these days, but he looked young. "We're closed," I said, working hard to take any unintended tone out of my voice. "The sign in the window says open," the kid said, glancing around the shop, a little wide-eyed at all the magic tricks, posters, and miscellanea that gave Chicago magic its old-world charm. At least, that's what I chose to think. He also might have been looking at all the clutter and dust. "I haven't gotten around to flipping the sign," I said, glancing at the customer to see if this interruption was having any sort of impact on his mood. He seemed as stunned at the kid's moxie as I was. "Well then, you're open," the kid said as he stepped further into the shop. "This won't take long anyway. I need your help, and I need it pronto." The door swung shut behind him, and I exchanged a look with the customer. He nodded a quick assent. "Okay," I said. "What's the problem?" The kid took a deep breath. "I need to make a tuba disappear," he said. "Like now." I like to think I've heard my share of odd requests in the 20-plus years I've either helped at the magic shop or run it on my own, but this was a new one. Deep down, I knew this moment was not an ideal one for tackling new questions, but I took the kid at his word that this would be a speedy exchange. "Just how do you mean, disappear?" I asked. "Like this," he said, pulling out his iPhone. He had a video from YouTube preloaded, and he held it up for me to see. The customer leaned in as well. I recognized the video immediately. It was David Copperfield, the magician, not the Dickens character, pulling off one of his most talked-about illusions, making the Statue of Liberty disappear. The pacing of the performance was a whole lot slower than I remembered, but for the television audience and the small audience watching it live on site, it was still an impressive feat. "That's a pretty big effect," I said. "The tuba's a pretty big instrument," the kid countered. "Fair point," I agreed. "But before we get into the how, maybe it would be best to go over the why?" The kid sighed, as if he was being forced to repeat previously discussed information to a much older, much dimmer person. He wasn't far off. "Tomorrow is a talent show at school. Everybody is required to perform in some way. My mom says I have to play the tuba because of all the money she's been shelling out for lessons." "Then why don't you just play the tuba?" "Are you kidding?" he nearly yelped. "A tuba? I'll be laughed off the stage." "He sort of has a point." This was from the customer, who up until now had been watching this exchange quietly, and I hoped patiently. "So instead," the kid continued excitedly, "I want to come out with the tuba and then make it disappear right before their eyes, as if by magic," he added, to ensure I was following his not-too-Byzantine thought process. "Okay, that's a fair premise. How much experience do you have doing magic?" The kid shrugged. "None, I guess. But it's only one trick," he said confidently. "I figured I could just buy something here to make it happen. Nothing too complicated or expensive," he added, "and nothing too big. I'm already hauling around a tuba." "Simple to do, not too expensive, and easy to carry around," I summarized quietly. This request was a common one, and sadly, not from just neophyte magicians. I was happy, not for the first time today, that my Uncle Harry was not manning the shop. It was just this sort of request that would have sent him into an apoplectic fit. "Well," I said as I processed the request, "a vanish like that requires a lot of control on the part of the magician. You need to manage the audience sightlines, the lighting, the backdrop, in some cases, the construction of the stage itself. Are you likely to have control of any of those factors?" I assumed these requirements would sound the death knell for his idea, but amazingly, he actually thought it over for several long moments. Finally, he shook his head. "No. All we get to do is walk out there and perform." "Well, making the tuba disappear seems to be off the table then," I said. "Wait," the kid began, but I held up a hand. "But that doesn't mean we still can't do something magical," I interjected quickly. "It's just a matter of figuring out what that something might be." Having faced variations on this question my entire working life, I did what I always did. I crossed the store to a large floor-to-ceiling bookcase that lined one wall of the shop. "The answer we need is somewhere in here," I said, glancing over my shoulder. The kid had followed me while the customer stayed at the cash register, his hands still shoved deep into the pockets of his worn and faded army jacket. From this new vantage point, I decided that his hair color was definitely sandy brown. He stared at me blankly, so I quickly turned back to the task at hand. The kid stood next to me while I scanned the spines of the books. He looked up at a sign positioned at the top of the bookcase. "What does 793.8 mean?" he asked. I glanced up at the placard. It had been there for so many years I had stopped seeing it, which was odd given that I had been the one to print it and post it. "Well, my Uncle Harry has had this habit for years of lending books from the store to magicians rather than selling them outright. In his view, if they don't like the book, they will bring the book back. If they do like the book, they will come back and pay for it." The kid looked up at me doubtfully. "How's that working out for him?" "About how you'd expect," I said, "which is to say, not well. And since I felt he was turning this into a lending library, I put up that sign. 793.8 is the Dewey Decimal listing for magic books in libraries." He was looking up at me blankly again, so I continued. "A library is a building where you can borrow books." He cut me off. "I know what a library is," he snapped. "I'm just surprised that any of them are still using the outmoded Dewey system instead of the far better Library of Congress classification method." Now it was my turn to stare blankly at him. "You hear the word precocious much?" I finally said. "Now and again." "I'm not surprised," I said, returning my attention to the rows of book options in front of me. "I think what we need is something that makes the tuba the cause rather than the effect, so that there's a reason for the tuba. Otherwise, it just seems like an unnecessary prop." My voice trailed off as I scanned the titles. Most were on magic theory, while others focused so minutely on specific styles of magic, cards, coins, big box illusions, that they would be essentially useless in this instance. And then I saw what I was looking for and gave a small cry of inspiration. "This is what we need," I said, as I pulled the book off the shelf and read the title out loud. Harry's Magic Emporium. I opened the book and began to page through it quickly. "What's it called?" The voice surprised me. I turned to see the customer was peering at us from across the room. He had moved away from his position leaning on the counter and had started to move across the shop. It's Harry's Magic Emporium," I repeated, splitting my attention between the book and the customer who was now moving toward us. "My Uncle Harry wrote it," I added. "I remember that book," the customer said, sounding surprised at the memory. "I had it when I was a kid. In addition to the tricks, there were a lot of dumb jokes in it, right?" "Yes, tons of them. No one loves a bad joke more than my uncle, but thankfully, no one loves a great trick more than he does either. Now, I seem to remember that he organized the book around the 13 different types of magic, the list he used to argue with Harry Blackstone Jr. about all the time, I said as I continued flipping through the book. There've got to be more than 13 magic tricks, the kid said. His tone suggested that he may have wandered into the wrong shop today. On one level, he was right, but his statement was off base. There are hundreds more, I said, but they can all be classified into one of 13 categories. You know, production, vanish, restoration, animation, penetration, transposition. Just like any time I tried to name all the 7 dwarfs, I started strong and then petered out about halfway through the list. You get the idea, I finally said, still paging through the book in hopes that inspiration would leap from one of the pages. The room was quiet for a few moments, the only sound being paper on paper as I scanned rapidly through the book. Do you serve crabs here? The question came from the customer, and I froze in mid-page turn. I looked over my shoulder at him. Excuse me? The patron says, do you serve crabs here? And the maitre d' says, we serve everyone, sir. Let me get you a seat. The customer laughed at the joke, shaking his head at the memory. I thought it was funny long before I understood what it meant. I nodded in agreement. I had that same reaction to a lot of Harry's jokes. They were like little joke time bombs, set to go off at a later unknown date. Like, why is 6 afraid of 7? I looked from the customer to the kid. The kid had no response, but the customer thought for a moment and then laughed. Because 7, 8, 9, he said, smiling for the first time since he'd entered the store. This is great, the kid said without inflection. Big laughs. But can we focus on my disappearing tuba? Right, I agreed, turning my attention back to the book. I think our best bet would be to use the tuba as a production tool of some kind, sort of like a magician's top hat. Do you have a stand for the tuba? I asked, without looking up from paging through the book. Of course I do. The thing's as big as I am, the kid snapped. I got the sense that, to his young mind, I was the stupidest person he had ever met. That will help, I said, flipping quickly to the chapter on production. Do you only have one copy of the book? This was asked by the customer, who had moved again and was now standing silently behind me. I successfully squelched a yelp. Nope. Harry has a ton of them, I said, reaching up and pulling another copy off the shelf. I handed it to the customer, who took his hands out of his pocket for the first time as he grasped the book and began to page through it. What if we did this? I began, seeing a chapter on silk productions. What if you came out and started to play, but only got some odd sounds out of the tuba, like, something was stuck in the horn? The bell, the kid said. What? It's called the bell. The whole thing is the horn. The part you can reach into is called the bell. The bell, whatever. What if that were the premise? You keep trying to play something with the tuba, and you get horrible sounds out of it, and you keep pulling different odd things out of the horn, the bell. The kid smiled and nodded. Sure, that would be fun. But there's limited space in the bell. I mean, not as much as you might think. Not a problem. We have ways around that, I said, handing the book to the kid. Go to the index and look up servant, I said, as I turned away and began to scan the products on the shelves. What's a servant? The kid asked, as he dutifully turned to the back of the book. It's a secret way to make things appear and disappear, I said. Magicians use them all the time. Cool, the kid said, focusing on his search. Indeed, I said absently. I was looking for items that were designed to pack small and transform to full size with very little effort. I saw a black and white cane that would do the trick, pulled it off the shelf, and then reached for a compact bouquet of roses. Here's one you'll like, the customer said suddenly. I spun around, but he had his face buried in the book. What musical instrument is found in the bathroom? He must have seen that I was busy looking for props, so he turned to the kid and repeated the question, barely able to contain his amusement. "What musical instrument is found in the bathroom?" The kid shrugged. "I don't know." The customer laughed as he gave the answer, sort of killing the joke while completing it. "A tube of toothpaste. Get it? A tube of toothpaste. You should use that one." "Sure thing," the kid said flatly, imitating the response of every comedian I've ever met when a layperson offers a joke for their act. "I'll get right on it." I cut into the conversation, laying out items on a nearby counter. "I don't know the sequence yet," I said as I arranged the ragtag selection of props. "But these are all things you can hide in in the bell or in a servante we put behind it." It took a few minutes, but between the kid and me, we structured a short but funny act that involved him pulling an impossible number of items out of the tuba, but still getting poor results every time he blew into the horn. While we worked, the customer leaned against the bookcase, paging through the book in his hands. Every few moments he would let out a small giggle or a yelp of recognition at a rediscovered magic trick or a long-forgotten joke. "Now, we just need a closer," I said, as we looked over the props we had assembled. "A final topper." The kid and I stared at the props, silently willing them to provide the answer we were looking for. The thick silence was broken by the customer. What do you call it? One of those things," he said, holding the book in one hand and gesturing toward his mouth with the other. He began to mime, yanking at his mouth, pulling us both into an impromptu game of charades. "Taffy, eating spaghetti, wax lips." He shook his head and then quickly flipped through Harry's book, finally finding the illustration he was looking for. A young man pulling a seemingly endless paper streamer out of his mouth. "A mouth coil," I shouted, feeling like I'd just won something. "A streamer mouth coil!" I moved behind the counter, trying to remember where we kept them and hoping we hadn't run out. "That will be great," the kid said, beaming. "I'll let the audience know that the bell is finally empty, then blow into the tuba one last time. I'll still get a horrible sound, and then I'll start pulling the streamer out of my mouth. That will kill! Thanks!" He looked over at the customer, who was still paging through the book as he walked away from us. The customer looked up, realizing that the compliment had been directed at him. "No problem," he said to the kid. Then he looked at me. "If it's okay, I'll take this book," he said. "I had one as a kid. Loved it. Really loved it." "Is that all you need?" I asked slowly. He smiled down at the book. "Yeah, this will do. But," he added, patting his pockets, "I forgot my wallet." "That's okay," I said, gesturing toward the 793.8 sign over the bookcase. "Remember, this is Harry's lending library." "Great," he said as he looked back at the book, flipping the pages happily. "Thanks a lot." He opened and closed the door, his attention still focused on reliving the memories the book was providing. I breathed a deep sigh, but my reverie was short-lived. "Boy, this looks like a lot of stuff," the kid said slowly, scanning all the items on the counter. "I don't think I can afford all these props." "Not to worry," I said, gathering them up and starting to load them into a brown paper sack. "On occasion, the lending library concept also extends to magic props," I lied. "And this is one of those occasions." "Really?" He clearly couldn't believe his good luck. For my part, neither could I. "Really," I said as I walked him to the door. "Come back after the show and let me know how it went." "And return the props." "Yes," I agreed, having already forgotten that caveat in the sudden flurry of feelings of relief. I saw him out the door and turned to head back to the register where the small bag the last customer had brought still sat by the open cash drawer. I flashed back to that moment. Was it only 10 minutes ago, when he had first thrust it at me, demanding the contents of the cash drawer, poking what he said was a gun from the pocket of his worn army jacket. I looked down, wiping at the rivulets of sweat that had been running continuously down the back of my neck. Most of the contents of the cash drawer were already in the bag, as he had demanded. The other half was positioned on top of the drawer, ready to follow their compatriots. I was about to put all the money back into the cash register when a thought occurred to me. I stepped back to the shop's front door and locked it, turning the deadbolt as well for good measure. And before I returned to sort out the mess at the cash register and calm my racing heart, I also had the presence of mind to do the one thing I wished I had done 30 minutes earlier, or an hour, or right away this morning before that first or last customer walked through my door. I flipped the sign in the front window with such force that I nearly pulled it off its string hanger from open to closed, because right now I was many, many things, but open for business was not one of them. This has been The Last Customer, written by John Gaspard, read by Jim Cunningham. Produced and engineered by Albert's Bridge Books at Grass Lake Studios. All rights reserved.